Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen, Kollegen, liebe Studierende, liebe Schülerinnen und Schüler, Lehrerinnen und Lehrer, liebe Gäste. Im Namen der Organisatoren des Kolloquiums zur Philosophie möchte ich Sie an diesem schönen Abend begrüßen. Mein Name ist Henning Preuker und ich will nur kurz zwei einführende Dinge sagen, bevor dann meine Kollegin Jessica Harmening eine kurze inhaltliche Einführung zum heutigen Vortrag geben wird und schließlich Peter Singer seinen Vortrag halten wird. Peter Singer ist hier noch auf dem Weg, er wird in wenigen Minuten eintreffen. Mein erster Punkt betrifft das Kolloquium zur Philosophie. Da heute viel mehr Teilnehmer als sonst zum Kolloquium gekommen sind, möchte ich Ihnen diese Veranstaltungsplattform kurz vorstellen. Es gibt das Kolloquium seit über 15 Jahren an dieser Universität. Es findet in lockerer Folge von inhaltlich nicht zusammenhängenden Vortrags- und Diskussionsveranstaltungen immer während der Semesterwochen statt. Dabei werden aktuelle Forschungsthemen aus der Philosophie zur Diskussion gestellt, an denen die jeweils Vortragenden gerade arbeiten. Die Themen reichen von solchen aus der Geschichte der Philosophie zu solchen verschiedensten Themen aus der systematischen Philosophie. Immer, wenn auch nicht deutlich erkennbar, geht es in letzter Instanz um das Schöne, Wahre und Gute. Selten interessieren sich dafür mehr bei unseren öffentlichen Veranstaltungen als so circa 30 Personen. Da es heute viel mehr sind, hier ein kurzer Hinweis zum Ablauf der einzelnen Sitzungen. Nach einer Einführung in die Arbeit des Vortragenden erhält dieser zuerst die Gelegenheit, einen ca. 45-minütigen Vortrag zu halten, der in der Regel nicht durch Zwischenfragen unterbrochen wird. Anschließend erhält das Publikum die Gelegenheit, kritische oder auch nur verständnisbezogene Nachfragen zu stellen. Selten stimmen die Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer des Kolloquiums in ihren Positionen überein, aber durch Rede und Gegenrede nähert man sich, wenn es gut läuft, doch einem einheitlichen Konsens an, der auch in der Einheit eines Widerstreits liegen kann. Das bringt mich zu meinem zweiten und letzten Punkt. Unabhängig von den einzelnen Themen, in denen es in den Kolloquiumssitzungen geht, sind diese immer dann für alle Beteiligten lohnend, wenn darin ein jeweils an der Sache des Denkens orientierter kritischer Austausch gelingt. Ein solcher sachlicher Austausch setzt Tugenden voraus, die leider nicht mehr selbstverständlich sind. Zuhören können, Neugier, Offenheit, Sachlichkeit und Argumentationsfähigkeit. An dies erinnere ich, weil Peter Singer zu oft Zielscheibe von uninformierter Kritik wurde, die nur auf der fragmentarischen Kenntnis seiner Theorie basiert. Wir möchten Professor Singer heute die Gelegenheit geben, seine Position zur Tierethik zu erläutern. Deswegen müssen wir weder Utilitaristen noch Vegetarier oder Veganer sein, aber doch bereit sein, die Argumente solcher frei in uns zu prüfen. Solche Freiheit der Rede und Gegenrede ist Voraussetzung von Philosophie. Wir können froh sein, dass wir die Freiheit haben. Zu dem in der Verfassung geschützten Recht auf freie Meinungsäußerung sagte kürzlich der Ehrendoktor dieser Universität, Bundespräsident Frank-Walter Steinmeier, ein paar kluge Worte, mit denen ich hier schließen möchte, weil sie die Situation der Diskussion von kontroversen Themen ganz gut hier passen. Steinmeier sagt: Freiheit braucht Regeln. Für unsere Debatten bedeutet das, bei aller Freiheit und selbst im Eifer des Streits muss etwas gewahrt bleiben, das ich durch zwei Begriffe zusammenfassen möchte: Anstand und Vernunft. Um die Vernunft muss man sich bei einem, das war Steinmeier, um die Vernunft muss man sich bei einem philosophischen Kolloquium wohl nicht sorgen. Ich hoffe aber, dass wir heute Abend zu einer Diskussion mit Anstand kommen, von der wir alle etwas lernen können. So, der Ablauf ist jetzt so, dass Jessica eine kurze inhaltliche Hinführung zum Thema macht und dann, glaube ich, Herr Blöhmann ein kurzes Grußwort der Universität geben wird.
Dankeschön. Ich hatte nicht damit gerechnet, dass Professor Singer schon da ist, aber ich freue mich sehr. Professor Peter Singer studierte ab 1963 an der University of Melbourne und setzte sein Studium 1969 bis 1971 nach Abschluss des Masters mit einem Stipendium an der University of Oxford fort. 1973 wurde er als Dozent für Philosophie an die New York University berufen. Im Jahr darauf, 1974, kehrte er nach Australien zurück und wechselte dort 1977 von der La Trobe, ich hoffe, ich spreche richtig aus, University in Bundoora, Victoria, als Professor an die Philosophische Fakultät der Monash University in Clayton, Victoria. 1983 wurde er einer der Direktoren und zeitweise auch Leiter des Centers for Human Bioethics. 1999 bekam er einen Lehrstuhl für Bioethik am Center for Human Values an der Princeton University. Seit 2005 ist er außerdem Ehrenprofessor am Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics der University of Melbourne. Professor Peter Singer wirkte insgesamt an über 50 Büchern mit, darunter zum Beispiel die Titel Animal Liberation, die Befreiung der Tiere, Practical Ethics, praktische Ethik, One World, The Ethics of Globalization, The Ethics of What We Eat, Why Our Food Choices Matter und The Life You Can Save, Leben retten, wie sich Armut abschaffen lässt. Er ist Begründer des sogenannten Präferenzutilitarismus und Befürworter eines effektiven Altruismus. Professor Peter Singer wird heute über Tierethik sprechen, genauer über den heutigen Stand der Befreiung der Tiere. Das Buch Animal Liberation wurde erstmals 1975 publiziert. Im ersten Kapitel verweist Peter Singer auf das satirische Werk Vindication of the Rights of Brutes, welches zeigt, für wie absurd einige Zeitgenossen Mary Wollstonecrafts Schriften zu den Rechten der Frau hielten. Heutzutage finden viele die Forderungen nach Rechten für Tiere nach wie vor absurd. Oder sie sind für diese Rechte theoretisch, aber werden in der Praxis nicht geachtet. Singer postulierte, dass wir das Unrecht, das wir Tieren antun, rückblickend erkennen werden. Ebenso wie wir nun Ungerechtigkeiten anprangern, die durch rassistische oder sexistische gesellschaftliche Normen existieren oder noch existieren. Analog zum Rassismus und Sexismus führte er den Begriff Spezizismus ein. Heute gilt Animal Liberation als Grundstein der modernen Tierrechtsbewegung. Singer argumentiert gegen Tierversuche und Massentierhaltung. Versuche an leidensfähigen Wesen sind nur dann zu rechtfertigen, wenn der Erkenntnisgewinn und der somit mögliche wissenschaftliche Fortschritt das verursachte Leid eindeutig überwiegt. Die Massentierhaltung moralisch zu rechtfertigen ist laut Singer nicht möglich. Er plädiert für den Vegetarismus. Mit beiden Forderungen ist Singer Tierrechtsgegnern zu radikal, diese haben allerdings eine eindeutig spezifistische Agenda und einigen Tierrechtlern nicht radikal genug. Vor dem Hintergrund der globalen Gesellschaft und der nicht mehr zu leugnenden Klimakrise scheint es unausweichlich, dass wir den Umgang mit unserer Umwelt und unseren Mitwesen reflektieren und neu verhandeln. Doch obwohl das Thema in den letzten Jahren in aller Munde ist, scheint sich noch nicht so viel geändert zu haben. Insbesondere im Umgang mit nichtmenschlichen Tieren sind die meisten Menschen in den Industrienationen gerne bereit, diesen Rechte und Schutz zuzugestehen, aber nur solange, wie die eigenen, oft monetären Interessen davon nicht betroffen werden. Seit 2008 wird in der Schweiz Tieren rechtliche Würde, genauer Tierwürde, zuerkannt. Dies ändert jedoch nichts an den qualvollen Lebens- und Sterbensbedingungen von Nutztieren in der Massentierhaltung. Erst in der vergangenen Woche wurde entschieden, dass das Schreddern von frisch geschlüpften männlichen Küken weiterhin erlaubt ist. Animal Liberation ist 1975 erschienen. Wie viel hat sich in den letzten 44 Jahren wirklich geändert?
So, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Universitätsmitglieder, liebe Gäste, dear Professor Singer, on behalf of the Executive Board of the University, I welcome you here at our university. We are happy to have you here. I think I'm in a very special situation at this university. Within the last 4 days, I had the honor to introduce 4 people from Princeton University at our university. I don't think that has ever happened before in our at our university. I also want to add that I actually read your book, Practical Ethics, like 20 years ago during a few glorious summer days like today, and I really enjoyed your book and I enjoyed thinking about what you said. As Jessica Harmening already said, I didn't agree with everything, but it was certainly worth thinking about. So, as Jessica already introduced you, you're academic credentials, your academic career, all that's left for me is to welcome you again here in Paderborn. We're happy to have you here. We're looking forward to your talk and to the hopefully lively discussion after your talk. Thank you for coming.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all of those who've been involved in bringing me here. Jessica, Dr. Poike, thank you very much for your welcome from the President. It's a great pleasure to be here in Paderborn and to see such a large audience. That's very good, and such beautiful weather. And for my plane to get here on time, which was very good as well. Otherwise, I would have kept you all waiting. So I'm very happy not to have to do that. So I will speak for perhaps something like 45 minutes because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so I'm going to begin with the main theme of animal liberation, the original work, which, as Jessica mentioned, I first published in 1975. And this book popularizes the concept of speciesism. I say popularizes because I didn't invent it. I took it from, I wrote this book, started writing this book when I was in Oxford, and I took the term from somebody I knew in Oxford, a man called Richard Ryder, who published a little leaflet, just a one-page leaflet about experiments on animals. And he had a picture of a very ill-looking chimpanzee that had been infected with syphilis to try to find out something about the cause of syphilis. And it had this word, speciesism, across the top of it, which I'd never heard of before. But I immediately grasped the idea that this was something analogous to racism and sexism, again, as Jessica mentioned. And I thought, that's an interesting parallel. What exactly is the nature of this parallel? And what I tried to do in the first chapter of Animal Liberation is to elaborate that idea a little bit, the nature of the parallel. And this is how I define speciesism in that chapter. So, as I say, it's a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. And I think you can see from the way that's formulated that if you replace the word species with race or sex, you would also have a reasonably passable definition of racism or sexism. So it's intended to make that parallel. Now, it's not intended to say this parallel is exact. It's not intended to say, for example, that the differences between the sexes or the races are anywhere near as large as the differences between the species. But it is intended to say that it's an attitude held by a dominant group, in each case, a dominant group, whether it's a dominant race, dominant sex, or dominant species, which disregards or at least discounts the interests of those outside the dominant group and favors that group. And if we're familiar with the history of racism and sexism, we will know that there's a whole ideology that develops to justify this idea that the dominant group is not simply more powerful, is not simply exerting its raw power over the others, but is somehow justified in doing that. And that ideology might be about the superiority of some races, or it might be about the biblical verse that says the children of Ham were to be our servants, which was interpreted by white racists as justifying the enslavement of Africans. Or it might be, again, in the case of sexism, again you can find biblical justifications for this idea of various sorts, beginning, I suppose, with Eve's sin, which caused all the trouble, or you can quote Paul about women not saying much except basically obeying their husbands. So you can find purported justifications in those cases, and of course we can in this case as well. We can find the biblical verse in Genesis in which God gives man dominion over the animals, or the idea that God made man in his own image, but not the animals. So you can find those sorts of justifications, and of course you can find justifications in the differences, the cognitive differences in particular between humans and other animals. But I don't think that these are justifications for the basic idea that the interests of members of other species count for less than the interests of members of our own species just because they are members of other species. Now, the rejection of speciesism, the argument against it, does not suggest that these interests are the same in each case. So, for example, here we see, it's a little bit light maybe for the slide, but I hope you can see, there's some cows with their calves. They're in a field, there's plenty of grass growing, they can move around. So you could say basically their interests are satisfied. Their interest in being in a social group that suits their instincts, their food, they're protected, they don't have any predators threatening them, and so on. On the other hand, that would not satisfy the interests of any of you, because obviously you're interested in understanding ethical arguments, maybe understanding philosophical arguments more broadly, presumably interested in getting an education if you're students at a university. So you have a lot of interests that the cows do not have. That's quite obvious. But despite that, I think there is a basic kind of equality that ought to prevail between different species. And this is what I think it is. It's the principle of equal consideration of interests, for the reason I just gave, has to be understood as giving equal weight to similar interests, irrespective of the species of the being whose interests they are. So, similar interests, because there's no comparable interest in a cow to getting an education, but cows and humans do have some similar interests. They certainly have interests in not feeling physical pain. So in situations where physical pain might be inflicted on an animal, we should give that the same weight as a similar degree of physical pain on a human, which again might be a different kind of stimulus causing the pain, because our skin may be more sensitive than that of the cow. Depends on the animal, I guess, how sensitive their skins are. But similar quantities of pain we should think of as equally bad, whatever the species of the being who experiences that pain. And conversely, if you can have similar kinds of enjoyment, then you could think similarly about that as well. So that's the kind of equality that I think we should defend in the case of different species. Equal consideration for similar interests. And of course that leaves questions, which I will come to, about, well, what about these different interests that we may have as well? Now, there's an objection to the claim that speciesism explains and shows why our current treatment of animals is wrong. And that objection is that it's not the difference in species that distinguishes humans from animals most importantly, but there are other important differences. And this is just some of them, right? But you'll recognize perhaps that a number of philosophers have talked about these differences. Most famously, perhaps, especially as we're here in Germany, Immanuel Kant talked about the importance of rationality and autonomy and self-awareness in terms of being an end in oneself. And he denied that animals are ends in themselves because they lack this self-awareness, self-consciousness, autonomy, rationality, different things, but they go together. And others have said, well, animals can't use language. That's another important difference. Now, as I say down the bottom here, strictly speaking, this is not speciesism. This is not saying it's because these beings are not members of our species that we don't have to give equal consideration to them. But perhaps it's a way of disguising speciesism. Maybe naked speciesism is too obviously on shaky ethical grounds. But there are other characteristics we can refer to. So what can we say about that? Well, that argument was already around at the end of the 18th century. And Jeremy Bentham, the founding father of the English Utilitarian School of Philosophy, was already aware of it. And this is a passage in which he responds to it. Let me just give you a little bit of context to this passage. It occurs in a footnote in his work, The Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. It's not, Bentham doesn't write a substantial treatise about animals, but he does have this really interesting footnote. Note the year when this is written, 1789, the year of the French Revolution. And Bentham starts off the footnote by saying, the French have discovered that the colour of a man's skin is no reason or no justification to hand him over to the caprice of a tormentor. What's he thinking about here? He's thinking about the fact that the French revolutionaries have had this declaration of the rights of man and citizen and have freed the slaves in the French colonies. And then he says, perhaps one day we will also discover that the nature of the tail of an animal, he refers to use a more technical term, but basically he's saying whether a creature has a tail or not, and also whether a creature has fur, that these are also do not mark what he calls the line at which, again, you can hand someone over to be tormented at the whim of someone else. And this is when this passage comes in now. He says, what else is it that should trace the insuperable line? So the line is this line between beings who, if you like, have some moral status that means you can't do things to them, like enslave them or just hand them over to somebody else who enjoys torturing them, and other creatures. And you have to remember that this is written when, in fact, there was no law in England, nor, as far as I'm aware, anywhere else in the world. There was no law that prevented you torturing an animal if you wanted to do so. If you enjoyed setting fire to cats, it was perfectly legal to set fire to cats in England in 1789, as it was in Germany and everywhere else. So he asked, well, what could trace the line between beings who can who have this status that you can't do this and those who can't. And then he considers the idea whether it's the faculty of reason or the faculty of discourse, of being able to use language, in other words. And I'm assuming that he has Kant in mind, at least where he talks about reason here. But he says, but I don't really know that for sure, I should say. I haven't got a source for that, and some scholars may correct me. But it certainly applies to what Kant says. So, but he then makes this comparison between animals, like a horse or a dog, and human infants. So he says, and I think anybody who's had children, as I have, will have to agree that you can communicate better with a dog or a horse than you can with a child of a week, a day, a week, or a month old. And in terms of them being rational, being able to solve problems, work something out, the horse and the dog will do better than the month-old infant as well. So that's Bentham's response to this. Now, there's an obvious objection to Bentham's response, and that is to say, well, it's all about potential, really, right? Sure, the infant is not at a day, a week, or a month able to converse with you, nor able to use reason, but they have the potential to do that. And that's why we should give them a moral status that is higher than that of the dog or the horse. But there's an answer to that too, although admittedly it's an answer that leads to somewhat dangerous grounds, and an answer that has led me to criticism here in Germany and elsewhere. So, and that is that it's not the case that all human infants have the potential to become more rational or more conversable than the dog or the horse. There are some who are born with such severe intellectual disabilities, such severe brain damage, that we can ascertain that they never will reach that level of the horse or the dog in terms of their rationality or their use of language. So the question that if you use this argument about potential to overcome Bentham's objection, you then have to say, well, what about those beings who don't actually have that potential? And I presume that we don't want to treat those human beings in the way we treat non-human animals. So I think that Bentham's argument still stands when you make the adjustment that I've just suggested. Okay, we can talk about that more in discussion if you have further questions. I want to mention one defense of speciesism that has been made by a well-known, relatively recent philosopher who died like a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, Bernard Williams. So Williams wrote this article called The Human Prejudice, which I read as aimed at things that I and other people in defending moral status of animals had written. And he's defending this idea that it's okay to have a prejudice, he even uses that term, to have a prejudice in favour of humans. And his argument starts by rejecting the idea that there's any kind of neutral or impartial or cosmic or universal point of view. That is, he says, once we have the world, he says that's a relic of a world not yet thoroughly disenchanted. I think what he means by that is it's a relic of a religious conception of the world, which Williams does not hold. And he says once you get away from that religious conception of the world, then there is no God's point of view because there is no God, but there's also no cosmic point of view. The cosmos is not a being with a point of view, and therefore the only points of views that we have are our own, in which we have our own activities, our own projects, as Williams calls them, that lead us to make these judgments. So essentially he's saying, if we're human and we have human projects, and those projects involve human beings and give them value. There's no independent or objective stance from which you can say, yes, but even if we're not that concerned about animals ourselves, nevertheless, we should give equal consideration to their interests, or it's wrong to treat them in the ways that we treat them. And Williams goes so far as to imagine that aliens invade our planet. And he imagines that they're very intelligent aliens, superior to us in their intelligence and in their powers. And they decide that, from their superior intellectual point of view, they decide that we're a problem, that we are messing up the planet or making a mess of things, and that the world would be much better if we were not there. And so they proceed to eliminate us. Now, Williams says this. He says, at this point, there seems to be only one question left to ask: which side are you on? Well, you might find that persuasive to some extent, but I think if we're thinking about this issue philosophically, we should reject this which side are you on question. For one thing, we can go back to the analogy with racism, and we can think of the racist. Let's say it's a person of our race, and let's say the person of our race is proposing doing dreadful things to people of another race. And you, at least initially, resist this. You say, hey, wait a minute. You shouldn't do terrible things to people because they're not members of our race. That's cruel, or a violation of rights, or something like this. And the person who is a member of your race then says, hey, wait a minute. Aren't you a X, whatever that race is? Whose side are you on? Well, obviously, in that context, I don't think any of you would think that was a good argument. So why is it a good argument here? I don't think it becomes any better of an argument when it's used about a species rather than about a race, or for that matter, about a sex. I think that it may be more difficult to take this more objective point of view in the case of non-human animals, partly perhaps because they can't speak up for themselves in the same way and say what they want. But it's not impossible to say, yes, even though I'm human, I think it's wrong to treat animals in these ways, and I don't think it's good enough to just say I'm human and that's the side that I'm going to be on. You would need to have some other justification for saying, why are we doing this to animals? So I don't think that this is a good objection to speciesism. There may be other objections. I don't have time to go into them all, and again, I'll welcome questions when we get to that stage of the evening. I do want to mention a difficulty that I think does exist, which is not really an objection to speciesism, but is an objection to its application. And that's the difficulty of knowing what the experiences of other animals is like. So there can be situations where there are conflicts between the interests of humans and non-human animals. That happens quite frequently. I might mention some a little bit later. And if we really want to say, so we should give equal weight, equal consideration to their different interests, we would need to know how great those interests are. We would need to know, as I said before, how severe is the pain of the cow or the chimpanzee or the dog or whatever else it might be. And what about their pleasures? Do they experience pleasure? How does that pleasure compare with ours? So there is a real difficulty there. That's something that we don't really know about. It's not even easy to imagine how we might know about it. Although perhaps at some future stage neuroscience will have developed to the point where we find things that correlate with degree of pain in humans and something similar in at least some of the non-human animals, and regard that as some sort of evidence. But at the moment we don't really have that. So I acknowledge that this is a problem, that really to apply what I'm going to say in all cases, we would need to overcome, or at least we need to have difficulty. But what I'm going to do, because now I'm going to look at some of the practical applications of the principle of equal consideration of interest, what I'm going to do is to focus on cases that seem to me to be pretty clear that we're doing more harm to animals than we're doing benefits to ourselves in the long run. And so that's the next section that I'm now coming to. So where we're going to look at the practice in particular about factory farming and fish, though I will say something briefly about animals in research. But I'm going to focus on the use of animals for food simply because the numbers are so immense in this area. So if you compare here the number of, and I'm just talking about vertebrate animals, in fact I'm really talking about comparing vertebrate land animals here, not fish. So the number of vertebrate land animals killed annually in research, we don't really have very good figures. This figure might be outdated. Particularly China has expanded its use of animals in research, but we could say roughly around 100 million. Now that's a lot of animals, undoubtedly, but compare it with the number of animals we use for food. According to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, we're talking about 74 billion animals raised and killed for food each year worldwide. So 740 times more animals used for food than used in research, not counting fish. So that's why I think this is really the big issue in terms of how we treat animals. Now, significant things have been achieved here, and again I think Jessica mentioned some of those things in introduction, but let me just run through them. I have the benefit of some slides. So when Animal Liberation was written, came out in 1975 and right up into at least the late 1980s, I think pretty much everywhere it was permitted to keep veal calves in stalls like this. So these calves were not here just for a few hours or a few days. They were taken from their mothers very early in life, and they were like that for the rest of their life, which was about 14 weeks. And they were unable, you can't quite see this here, but they're unable to turn around in these stalls. The stalls are too narrow to turn around. They can't walk backwards and forwards more than a step or so. The stall is basically a box built around the calf's body, and the calves have nothing to do all day except stand up and lie down. They can do that, and they get fed with a sort of milk replacer that's put in the buckets that are put in those metal hoops you see there. So that's been banned across the entire European Union and in a number of other jurisdictions as well, including in the United States, particularly the state of California. Similarly, it was permissible to keep breeding sows. So these are the mothers of the pigs that are killed for bacon and ham and so on. Breeding sows in stalls that are again too narrow for them to turn around and really only permit them to stand up and lie down, and not even lie down all that comfortably. If you can see, the slide's not all that clear maybe, but maybe you can see the legs of this sow on the left are sticking into the crate or stall of the one on the right. So that's also been banned in European Union and California and a few other places. Similarly, the standard battery cage for hens has been banned, although it's still possible to keep, these are laying hens, egg-laying hens. It's still possible to keep them in cages, but the cages have to be significantly larger than they were, and they have to have a nesting box so the hens can lay their eggs in a kind of protected area, which is a strong instinct that hens have, not to lay their eggs out in the open, but they used to have no alternative. What you can see from this hen is with the crowding, she's lost all her feathers on her chest, and they're in pretty bad condition on the wings. That's probably from rubbing against the wire and against other hens, but it could be because she's been pecked by other hens as well, because in a small cage you can't get away from a more dominant hen. So there's been significant improvements in those three areas of confinement, which were perhaps the closest confinement, the most severe confinement of farm animals at the time I wrote Animal Liberation. And we should welcome that. But there's one very large area of intensive farming that has not really changed significantly, and that is the largest in terms of numbers, which is chicken production, chicken meat production we're talking about here. So this is the standard method of production, a huge shed, you can see it stretching into the distance, holding maybe 20,000 birds in a single flock there. And as you see here, it's described by Professor John Webster of the University of Bristol, who's an eminent vet who founded one of the largest centres for the study of animal welfare in Europe. And he describes it as the single most severe systematic example of man's inhumanity to another sentient animal. So why does he say that? Well, partly maybe the numbers are influencing him, but the other problem, well, there are a number of different problems, but one is the problem of the fast breeding of these birds. So one of the reasons why chicken has become much cheaper than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago is that the birds have been selectively bred to eat more, grow faster, and therefore reach market weight in a shorter time. So the birds that are available to be bought in supermarkets, if you do that, are generally about 6 weeks old, somewhere between 6 and 7 weeks old. They're very young birds, but they have reached a weight which 30 or 40 years ago would have taken at least twice as long for a bird to reach. Now, why is that a welfare problem? Well, it's a welfare problem because the legs of the birds are often not strong enough to support this weight that's been put on very rapidly. The legs are immature given how young the bird is. So here's an example of a bird whose legs have collapsed under her so that she's no longer able to move. Chickens do not normally sit down in that kind of position with their legs splayed under them, and in fact they don't normally sit for long on this litter in the intensive shed at all. What she's sitting on, as you see, is kind of what's known as litter. It's maybe wood chips or wood shavings or straw or something like that. But the problem with it is that it's full of bird droppings because it's not cleaned out every 6 weeks when the birds are taken out and taken to kill. It could be left there for a whole year. So the droppings are high in ammonia. The atmosphere of the shed is warm and moist. The ammonia forms a weak acid in the straw, and if birds sit on it for a long time, they get acid burns on their hocks, on their thighs. So that's why you don't normally see those birds sitting down, and for this to happen is clearly something has gone wrong. Now, what's going to happen now to this bird? Well, the answer is, in an intensive chicken shed, this bird is going to die of thirst or hunger, because nobody is going to check up on the health of the birds and say, oh, here's a bird in trouble, at least we better wring its neck and put it out of its misery quickly. It simply doesn't pay, given the price of chickens. It doesn't pay to employ the labour to inspect the chickens to find birds like that. So, and the bird will starve or die of thirst because the chances are she won't be able to get food or water. If you look at this slide now, you see these lines going down. Those are the pipes that bring food or water. Well, if the bird's lucky enough for her legs to collapse when she's next to a pipe, okay, maybe she'll survive a while. But if she's in the middle between the pipes, she can't walk, so that's why she's going to probably die of thirst. So I think that's one of the things that John Webster is concerned about. He also says that even those birds whose legs don't collapse, which of course is the majority of the birds, they are in pain for the last 2 weeks of their life, he estimates. He compares the pain to that of somebody who has arthritis and is forced to stand all day. So he thinks that they're suffering in that way too. Now, what you have to remember is that this is a vast number of birds, and even if, let's say, go back to the ones who are like this, even if that's only 1% of the birds, if you have billions of birds and you're talking about 1% of a billion birds, you're talking about 10 million birds that are dying of thirst or starving. And that's certainly the kind of figures that you would be talking about in places that are large producers. The United States, for example, produces something like between 8 and 9 billion birds a year. So you're talking about 80 to 90 million birds starving to death under that system. And presumably the European Union is somewhere along those lines as well. Okay, need to move on. I want to say a little bit about dairy, just because it's not only meat that is the problem, and if you want reasons for the rise in the vegan movement, I mean, there are a number of different reasons, but one of them, I think, is an awareness that dairy production involves a fair amount of cruelty to animals, partly because it's become much more intensive. Not all cows are out on the fields all day, but also because it does involve the separation of the cow and her calf. In order to get milk, a cow has to be made pregnant. It's the same with humans, of course. Women do not start producing milk unless they've had a baby. And the same happens with a cow. And the cow's milk will start to fall off after a year, or a bit less than a year, unless she's made pregnant again. So roughly at yearly intervals, the cow gives birth. There's a strong bond. Cows are mammals. There's a strong bond between the cow and her calf, as you see here. But the calf will be taken away within a day or so of birth. And the cows clearly are suffering from this. The calves too, of course. If the calves are female, they might be reared for dairy cows themselves. If they're male, they'll probably be killed quite early for veal, although some of them might be reared for hamburger. But they're not kept for beef because they're not the right breed of cow for that. So there will be this separation, and the cow will call for a calf. Farmers will acknowledge that sometimes if you take the calf away at a particular spot and the cow passes that spot again days later, she will look around and call for the calf because she remembers that the calf was taken there. So dairy is also not immune from problems of animal welfare. Okay, I also want to say something, again, rather briefly about fish, because here too the numbers are enormous. The numbers of fish, aquatic creatures generally, caught for food is much larger even than the number of vertebrate land animals. It's hard to know exactly what the numbers are because fisheries don't report numbers, they report tons. So you have to make an estimate. But estimates tend to start close to 1 trillion fish being killed each year. So 1,000 billion fish being killed each year. So again, enormous numbers. As you can see, in fact, if you look at what is happening. So here's an ocean trawler trawling a net behind her. You can see that the net is a very large net, goes on, would come back a long way to where the photo is being taken from as well. You can see all individual fish squashed sort of through the gaps in the net, but the whole net is going to be full of a vast quantity of fish. And just so that you do see one of those individuals, so here's a haddock caught, pushed through the net of a Scottish trawler, but the whole net is going to be full of fish who are going to be dying slowly. It's true that their lives may not have been affected by us humans, but their death is certainly not a humane one. All right. Now, you might say, all right, so that's factory farming, and that does look pretty nasty, and maybe I should avoid factory farm products. What about other animal products? Well, it certainly can be a lot better. Compare the cages that I showed you, although admittedly the European cages are slightly better than the ones I showed you, but still compare, they are still cages and they are still indoors. Compare that with this. This is a free-range organic chicken farm, photographed near Princeton. As as you can see, the hens are outside, they're on grass, and they have a shed to go into at night. So in the evening, the hens will go into the shed. They sort of will instinctively go in at night. If not, the farmer will shoo them in if there are a couple of strays. And that's important because a lot of countries you have foxes, and foxes will certainly attack hens, especially if they're out at night. But also it's important because the hens will then lay their eggs inside the shed where they have nesting boxes, and they're easy for the farmer to collect. And then in the morning, the farmer will move them around. This little shed is on wheels and can be towed by a tractor because otherwise the hens will always be around close to the shed, and the grass then will disappear close to the shed. So you move it around, you keep the grass going better. So yes, that's not a bad life for a hen. She's outside, she's on grass, she has shelter and so on. There are some things that you could say about that. Firstly, these are hens. The breed produces males as well, obviously. They're no use. They can't be used for meat. They don't put on weight fast enough to be worth doing that to. So they get sorted out as day-old chicks, and they get killed within the first day of life, sometimes relatively humanely, sometimes not so humanely. So that's one aspect of it. Secondly, the hens themselves their rate of lay will start to drop off after probably after 1 year or so of laying eggs, maybe a little bit longer. So the farmers will get rid of them too at some point because they don't want to keep hens who are laying less frequently than other hens they could get. The hens themselves are cheap. So in terms of killing animals, that's still involved, but in terms of their actual lives, it's not so bad. And you've already seen these cows. Again, the life is not a bad one, although, of course, the calves are going to be killed for their meat. Now, what about that question of killing? I need to say a little bit about that. Here's a quote or a view from a conservative British philosopher called Roger Scruton, an essay called The Conscientious Carnivore, who says that it's okay to be a conscientious omnivore. That is, he doesn't support factory farming. He thinks that's indefensible, doesn't respect the interests of animals. But if the animals are well looked after, he thinks that that's okay. He points out that they would not exist without humans, and that's pretty much true. I mean, certainly they wouldn't exist in the quantities, and the particular animals would not exist because they've been bred for their characteristics in terms of producing meat or milk or laying eggs. And he thinks that killing them painlessly is not in itself tragic, so eating animals is justified when they're properly looked after. Now, the difficult ethical question here is, of course, whether it's true that the killing of the animals is not in itself tragic. And this is what Scruton says about that. He says, in terms of a human being, there's a distinction between a timely and an untimely death. So think about those of you here who are students and relatively young. It is unfortunately timed because you've got a whole lot of things in front of you that you are looking forward to doing, that you want to achieve. You're students here, you're hoping to graduate from the university. After you graduate, perhaps you want to do certain things. You want to get some kind of job. Maybe you don't want to get a job. Maybe you want to save up and travel around the world for a year, but that's still something you want to do. Maybe you have particular achievements already that you're thinking of that you would like to do. So your death would prevent you having those achievements. But Scruton's argument is that this doesn't apply to cattle, for example. They don't have achievements. They will go on living. They will go on maybe enjoying their life, but it's not an untimely death. And especially, he goes on to say, if they're replaced by other animals, then there's still another animal enjoying that life, so the death of the one that's replaced by another is not such a bad thing. Now, that argument, you can think about whether you accept that argument or not. One implication, though, is it takes us back to that argument that Bentham put forward, which has been sometimes called the argument from marginal cases. That is the argument from like infants or those who lack the abilities that we're talking about that are necessary for having achievements, the abilities that Scruton is really relying on in distinguishing the killing of a human from the killing of a cow. So if that does apply to some humans, would we draw the same conclusions, that the killing of a human who's capable of having achievements is a tragedy, whereas the killing of a human who is not capable of having such achievements because of their incurable, let's say, incurable intellectual brain damage, disabilities, would we take the same view? If you do, well, obviously that's a controversial conclusion that a lot of people don't want to hold, and is a challenge to ethical views that we have about the equal rights of all human beings. But if you don't, it's necessary to explain why this argument about the tragedy of killing in some cases and not others only applies between humans and animals and doesn't apply within humans. And Scruton doesn't really explain that. So at the very least, there's a gap in that argument. Okay, let me say just a little bit briefly about experiments on animals. An experiment that is invasive or harms the animal. Perhaps, you know, observational experiments are okay, they might say. And some of these people are defending a view based on rights. So philosophers like Tom Regan, who sadly died a couple of years ago, wrote a book called The Case for Animal Rights. He opposes all animal experimentation because he thinks it's a violation of the rights of animals to use them for human benefits in ways that harm them. So you could have other views too. You could have a kind of a Kantianism that applied to animals, although Kant himself did not apply it to animals, but you could have the view that he made a mistake there, that animals are ends in themselves, and that it's always wrong to use a being who is an end in themselves as a means to the ends of others. But I don't hold a rights view, certainly not an absolute rights view. I mean, I can hold the view that we want to recognize that humans have certain rights, or perhaps we want to recognize that animals have certain rights, if that's something that we want to incorporate in law or in custom. But I don't think the foundations of ethics can come from ideas about rights. And again, I won't elaborate on that now, but I'm happy to do so in discussion. So I also don't hold a sort of Kantian view about it's always wrong to use one being as a means to the end of another. I'm a utilitarian, so I think that you have to go with where the greatest benefit overall is for all of those who are affected. I simply differ from those who offer typically justify animal experimentation on those sorts of grounds by saying the interests of the animals have to count fully. You can't discount them because they're non-humans. But there are some experiments that I would have difficulty in, from the position I take, to object to. And this is one example that was put to me some years ago when I had a conversation that was filmed for a BBC video with a professor at Oxford University called Tipu Aziz, who was doing research on deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. So deep brain stimulation does not cure Parkinson's disease, but it enables, it reduces the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Aziz was arguing that his research on about 100 monkeys was the only way in which this treatment could have been explored, could have discovered exactly what kind of electrical stimulation of what part of the brain was going to be helpful to people with Parkinson's, and that his research had helped 40,000 patients with Parkinson's and helped them significantly to cope with Parkinson's. Now, I don't know whether his facts were right, really. I've tried to do a little bit of research around that area, but I'm certainly not expert on it, and I can see somewhat differing opinions about the value of deep brain stimulation and about the role that animal research played in it. But let's just hypothetically accept the facts as stated here. Let's just hypothetically accept that you could do research on 100 monkeys in which you did your best to minimize the pain to them. And let's say, you know, you operated on them, you have to implant these electrodes, but you do that under anesthesia, of course. You give them the best possible recovery. You give them a reasonably stimulating environment. And if the stimulation, when you do it, appears to be causing pain, you stop doing it. Suppose that these experiments were performed under those conditions, and they did, in fact, significantly help 40,000 people with Parkinson's, and no doubt there will be more to come in the future. I would not be able to say that that research was wrong or unjustified, because even if you give full weight to the interests of the monkeys, I think they're overridden by the benefits for the patients. So that's why my view on animal experimentation is not that it is always wrong, but that it's, as a practice, it is wrong insofar as it does not give proper weight to the interests of the animal subjects of research. And if it does give the proper weight, and if really every effort is used to try to minimize animal suffering, to find other ways that don't involve animal suffering to do research, and there are a number of promising other techniques in many cases, then we might be able to say that the practice could be justified. And I raised the question here about basic research, which is more difficult than something like Parkinson's because you just don't know what the results are going to be. And I think that there's a lot of basic research done on animals that does not produce any desirable results and does clearly harm the animals and is not justifiable. But it's because of the difficulty of saying in advance what will pay off, I think you need a committee of experts to try to assess how good the chances are of this being really research that makes an important breakthrough. Okay, I'm very near the end now. The last thing that I want to say goes back, leaves the question of the treatment of animals, which I've been focused on, but does say something about food ethics, which I think is relevant to the rise in vegan eating that I've mentioned already, and that is, I think, one of the interesting phenomena that's been happening in the last 10 years or so. It's not motivated only by concern for animals, although I think that is a motivation for many people, but it's motivated by concern for climate as well. So as this diagram, slide shows, and it's a study for the US, perhaps US meat consumption is higher than that in Europe on average, but you can save a lot of carbon emissions by switching from the beef on the left to the vegan rice bowl dish on the right. Just for comparison, as it says here, this is saving about 1.5 tons of carbon per year. Just for comparison, if you switch from a standard American vehicle to a Prius, Toyota's hybrid Prius, which is one of the most fuel-efficient cars on the market other than all-electric vehicles, you save about 1 ton of carbon. So in fact, changing your diet can produce a bigger reduction in your carbon footprint than changing the car you drive. Of course, if you change from a car to a bicycle, you'll do better still, but not everybody can do that. Finally, this is my last slide. This is the view of the Food and Agriculture Organization, again, the United Nations body, in a report that's now a few years old, but I think it stood up reasonably well. You might quibble a little bit about whether it's 18% or 16% or something like that, but essentially it's saying that the livestock greenhouse gas emissions are greater than that of the entire transport sector. So all of the cars, buses, trains, ships, and aeroplanes that are moving around. So if that's so, then even if we move away from fossil fuels, and I've noticed flying into the airport here in Paderborn that there's a lot of wind power going on here, and that's terrific. That's definitely good. But if in fact we continue on a diet that's heavy in meat, then we are going to still have greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere that in the long run are going to get us to the same point that we would have got to faster if we hadn't switched to renewable energy to the extent that we have. Now, of course, having more time is a good thing. We can hope for greater changes, greater alternatives, but in the end, if we want a sustainable planet, we can't continue eating meat at the levels that we are. Gone slightly over the 45 minutes, but not too badly, I think. So I'm happy to take your questions in the time we have remaining.
So first, thank you for your presentation. I'm very glad I'm here and had the chance to listen to you. So my question would be talking about the example with the Parkinson and the chimpanzees. I would like to know what was the ultimate and decisive argument to use monkeys and not to go with human objects. Because in the end, if we consider the equal considerations of interest, I would say that animals and or the human animals and the non-human animals both have similar interests in not risking, I don't know, bad conditions that are caused by medication or these experiments. So I would like to know which interest decided that the monkeys are the better choice in this case.
Okay, so I suppose one, I think it's a good question to ask that, and one issue that you would need to ask, I think, would be, could you find human volunteers for this research? So if you could find human volunteers, then it's difficult to argue that we shouldn't use that. Of course, this assumes that you're going to get permission from the human subjects ethics committee, which probably you wouldn't in practice now. But I take it that the question is about, well, is that situation right? Should it be okay to get permission more easily from the animal experimentation committee than the human experimentation committee? So if you could get volunteers, then I think there would be a good case for saying, let's use the volunteers. Now, of course, you could get volunteers who are suffering from Parkinson's themselves, and that in some way would be a better research subject. But obviously, at least when you begin the research, there's a high risk that things will go wrong, that you're implanting electrodes in the wrong place, that you'll cause some brain damage. So you might not be able to get volunteers for that reason. And if you can't, then I think there is something different about grabbing humans who know that they're going to be used for research that they haven't consented to. And I think you could say that's going to cause more problems in society in the long run, and we don't want to do that. But yeah, it is an interesting thing to think about. Thank you.
Have the humans who know what will happen to them in these cases of human experiments, what would be about humans who don't know what will happen to them in specific situations, like I don't think it's good, but what about retards or like this, something like this?
Okay, so obviously that would be the next question to ask if you don't get volunteers. If you're doing it with monkeys, again, it's the same question that Bentham asked, right? What about others who are at the same intellectual level as the monkeys? Again, one difference would be that people with severe intellectual disabilities will have parents who may not want them used. That's very often going to be the case. It may not always be the case, because sometimes they might have abandoned their children when they learned of the nature of the intellectual disability. So that would be one issue. My guess is that if that were the case, in fact, people would be too reluctant to do that, and they simply wouldn't do it because of the fact that we're dealing with humans who are like us, and it couldn't be, incidentally, really infants, because they had to the monkeys, I think, had to do various tasks. They were trained to do little tasks to see whether they could control their, the tremors that Parkinson has. So I think probably if you did really set that standard, you would put such pressure on researchers to find alternatives that they probably wouldn't do the experiments. And you might say that, well, that's a good thing because that's the proper test, really. But it might be that, in fact, the research would simply come to a stop, and then maybe that would be a bad thing for the sufferers of Parkinson's. But I have to accept that if you think of it simply as a philosophical question, it's very hard to see why it would be justified to do this on monkeys and not justified to do it on humans at a similar intellectual level who had been abandoned by their parents.
Human induce on other animals in order to make them suffer or have negative effects on them. I was wondering how your theory extends to the ideas of passively of being passive in the moment when animals suffer, like for example in the natural environments.
Okay. So I think there are different kinds of passivity here. One example might be you have a cat who you allow to go outdoors. You notice, looking out the window of your office perhaps, that your cat has caught a bird, and as cats sometimes do, the bird is not dead, but the cat is kind of playing with the bird. So should you be passive in that situation? I think no. I think you should, if there's still a chance that you can save the bird and the bird will recover. Anyway, you should stop the cat tormenting the bird. Even if the bird won't recover, you should put the bird out of its misery. But it's a more difficult situation if you're talking about suffering in nature among wild animals, because there are a lot of questions, but one question is, do you really want to stop predators killing prey, for instance? That's one kind of suffering. And what will that do to the balance of nature? So, in fact, we're familiar with that kind of situation, really. At Princeton, where I teach, there are a lot of deer in the forests. Now, the deer used to have predators. They used to have wolves. They used to have indigenous Americans. But they don't anymore. So they multiply. And although some of them get killed by motor cars, you could say that's their major predator now. But a lot of them do just starve to death in the winter when there's less food around. And that's not a good death. So, if you remove predators, you're likely to end up in that situation. And that's not a good thing. There are now philosophers discussing these questions about wild animal suffering. And some of them go so far as to argue that the balance of nature is such that there's more suffering than there is enjoyment in wild animals. And that this is a reason why maybe the preservation of nature is not a good thing. But obviously there's a lot of other values involved in preserving nature. Animal welfare is not the only value. A lot of people think that there are ecological values in preserving something that has evolved without us for hundreds of millions of years, and that we shouldn't destroy that. And then there are questions about benefits of nature for the sustainability of the planet and a lot of other things. So although I can see an argument that in theory it would be good to reduce suffering wherever it occurs, including in nature, I don't personally favour taking those steps in the present situation. There might be some particular circumstances where the case for it is strong enough and the negative consequences are not going to happen. You can know that. But in general, I think we should be focusing on the suffering we're causing, and perhaps when we've eliminated that, we might turn our attention more seriously to the suffering of animals in nature and ask whether there's anything that we can do about that that is justified in terms of all of the values that are involved in the preservation of nature.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting, and it brought me closer to a topic I've put probably quite some effort into avoiding so far. My question is regarding the argument you presented for killing animals in general, where you presented an argument that went, if I recall correctly, that killing humans is tragic, whereas killing animals is not. Could one instead argue that killing in general is not inherently tragic? If I were to die right now instantaneously and painless, it wouldn't concern me. It would concern those that remain, my loved ones, my peers, but I couldn't care less, I suppose. So if there are animals which, not as the cows in your talk, but maybe a fish that lives a solitude life, does not have social bounds, would killing such an animal be inherently tragic?
Yes, there's quite an extensive debate among philosophers on that issue, including a German philosopher, Tatjana Wisak, who's written a book called Killing Happy Animals, which is just about that issue, and has edited together with Robert Garner a book of essays on that topic. The view that you take is a possible view, a view that is certainly there in the literature, that killing is not tragic in itself for the being killed, if the killing is instant, but is tragic maybe for others who would love and care for the one who is killed. And that's a view that can be defended, for instance, on hedonistic utilitarian grounds, that is, in terms of simply adding up the pleasures and pains of a life. But it depends how you calculate it, because let's say that you are killed now instantly. It's not a loss for you in the sense that you don't regret that you're not around, but assuming that your life is positive, it's the loss of the future years that you would have had. Let's say you would have lived another 30 years. Let's say they also would have been positive, so you would have enjoyed that, and now that's lost. So that might be seen as a tragedy for you anyway, in that you could have had a better life than you did by being killed at that age. Scruton's argument does draw a distinction between farm animals that wouldn't apply to you, in that he's saying, well, the farm animals only exist because they're being raised for food. And if you say you can't kill them, then, of course, the farmers are not going to raise them, because nobody wants to eat the meat of a cow that's died at the age of 15. So you know, Scruton would say, well, if you're a hedonistic utilitarian and you're summing up the happiness of the cows, as long as they do have happy lives, it's actually better that they get killed at an age when somebody is going to pay for their flesh, because otherwise they simply wouldn't exist. So that's one argument. Of course, you have to say, well, what would happen if the cows were not there? Perhaps there'd be a lot of smaller wild animals existing in that field. Maybe the field would become a forest. But then we do get back to the question that was raised just before. Would those wild animals be enjoying their life as much as the cows, who after all were protected from predators and so on? So there are a lot of questions. Once you get into questions about the wrongness of killing, the philosophical questions sort of open up, expand, and there's a lot of discussion, and I have to say I'm not completely settled in the view that I hold myself on this issue.
Hello? Okay. I have a more provocative question, probably. And it takes us away from the animal question and more to the question of carbon dioxide emissions, because your argument, or one of the arguments, was that changing the diet lessens carbon dioxide emissions. And I was recently thinking also regarding the Friday for Future movement and everything. We as scientists, or you as a scientist, we travel around the world a lot, and we take flights and we go from one place to the other. And even though it's not necessary to be at one place in person, like physically, because we could also have that talk via, I don't know, Skype or something like this. So how can we morally justify the academic system of flying around the world for a 20 minutes talk at a conference and then going home after 1 or 2 days? That's my question.
Maybe you should pass the microphone to Jessica, who's next to you and who was responsible for the fact that I'm here today.
I actually asked her whether you came from Australia, but she told me that it just
So I came from Australia, but not to give this talk, right?
Yeah, I heard, okay. Yeah.
And in fact, I don't accept whether I'm in Australia or in the United States, I don't accept invitations to travel intercontinentally for a single talk.
It wasn't a personal question, so it's just a general question.
So basically, I think you're right that we should do more talks over video links of some sort, and I do a number of talks now over video links. But there are a lot of people who still feel that it's not the same, and I'd guess that if you'd advertised that I was speaking over video link here today, you would not have booked, the organisers would not have booked such a large theatre, and if they had, there would be a lot of empty seats in it. So it still seems to be true that being there in person, engaging with the audience is a little bit different. Now, it would be nice if we could avoid that, and I do think it would be good if we could fly less than we do. And as I say, but there's a lot of things that we could do. We can eat less meat, we can try to find clean energy, we can advocate as citizens that we should be doing more about all of these things. So I certainly think that those things are true. But exactly how much flying is justified by the fact that I reach a larger audience, again, that's really hard to calculate.
So my question is also about the Parkinson's experiment. You said that you see it as justifiable because it helped more people than it hurt animals. But how can we know that before we've done the experiment? So we'd have to say every experiment should be done because it has the potential to help more than it harms, right? Otherwise, on the other hand, we could also say every experiment has the potential to not help as much and therefore be not justifiable, and we should ban all experiments. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, not every experiment has the same chance of making a difference. So I think you need to have an investigation as to, firstly, what are the chances that this experiment will lead to some beneficial treatment? And also, as I already said, are there other ways of doing this, getting to these benefits without the experiment? So it's a matter of trying to estimate that in advance. Now, you're quite right that there are going to be experiments which look as promising as Dr. Aziz's experiment, but in fact do not work, do not pay off. And Dr. Aziz, therefore, could not know in advance, could not really know for sure that his experiment would benefit a large number of patients. But he may have had promising background understanding, theoretical understanding of how Parkinson's works and what might be an effective treatment. And presumably on that basis, he put the proposal up to some animal experimentation ethics committee, which approved it. Now, admittedly, that committee would not have been weighing the animal interests as much as comparable human interests, but it would have been considering whether this research was promising enough to go ahead and to be funded, of course. The funders presumably must have also been convinced it was promising enough. So it's not going to be an easy judgment, but I think you could argue that the potential for benefit was so great, 40,000, let's say, versus 100, that it would be justified to try an experiment even if the chances that it would succeed were significantly less than 100%. Maybe if they were even only 25%, you might say that that could be justified. And that's, again, as I say, assuming, which I don't know for sure, that there was no other way of finding out this kind of treatment without using monkeys or other animals.
Okay. Hello. Early on in your presentation, you stated that let me try to quote, I took a note, but it's not accurate, absolutely. We ought to consider similar interests by similar weights regardless of species, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
That is right.
So in ethics, I'm always a bit wary about odd statements because they need to be begründet, justified. So I would like to know what is your reason for this statement? So how do you justify it?
Okay, so you're asking a sort of a fundamental question about the argument for equal consideration of interests. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so what I've done in today's talk, and in fact what I've done in animal liberation itself, is to assume that you as an audience accept that it would be wrong to discount the interests of a being because of that being's race or sex. And I've then argued that in these cases we had this powerful group that develops an ideology that was not justified for giving less weight to the interests of other beings. And I've suggested that the distinction of species is not in itself a better distinction than the distinction of race or sex. That is, it's not in itself a more obviously morally relevant distinction. And I did consider one objection to that. Well, I guess I considered Bernard Williams, which is an objection to exactly that claim, and I argued against that. And I considered claims about rationality and autonomy and self-awareness and so on, and I suggested that they did not really fit with our views, with the view we have, which is that we give all humans some rights or some moral status that non-human animals don't have. So this is all a kind of an ad hominem argument, if you like. It's an argument that presupposes that you have certain ethical views and says, if you hold those ethical views, it's very difficult to see how we could justify the treatment of non-human animals the way we do treat them. But somebody might say, well, suppose, you've got to justify all of this to me. You've got to justify to me why racism and sexism are wrong as well. Why shouldn't any group, prefer their own interests? And then I would have to go to a different kind of argument, which is harder to ground, and that is, why does, say, pain matter, or why does pleasure a good thing, or why is promoting the interests of any being a good thing? And I have tried to defend that, but in other works, there's a book called The Point of View of the Universe that I co-authored with a Polish philosopher, Katarzyna de Lazary-Radek, and we draw on Henry Sidgwick's work. Sidgwick was a 19th century utilitarian philosopher, so in a sense a successor to Jeremy Bentham, but a more careful philosopher, I have to say, than Bentham, though maybe not as brilliantly original as Bentham. And we draw on his view that we can take, contrary to Williams, we can take a kind of a cosmic point of view, a point of view of the universe. Not that the cosmos has a point of view, but we can take it in our imagination. And from that point of view, we can see that the interests of other beings, when they're similar to mine, matter just as much from this cosmic point of view. And we can argue from that this is a kind of a distinctively ethical point of view, one that gets beyond our own prejudices and biases, and so therefore it's right to act in accordance with this idea that the interests of other beings are similar to ours. So you may still reject that. You may say, I don't see why that's true, or Sidgwick thinks it's kind of self-evident. You may say you don't see that. But we then have to discuss whether there are any truths in ethics or not, or whether it's all a matter of subjective attitudes. So that's another topic, not a topic for tonight. I'm sorry.
So my question would be if you would rather kill someone who is imprisoned for life, who is basically a socially and economical burden to the people, instead of keeping them in a prison, even though they basically by themselves say that they don't have anything to lose anymore?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if they themselves are saying that their life is not worth living and that it will continue, as far as they can tell, it will continue not to be worth living, then I would see this situation as parallel to that of somebody who is terminally ill, and because of the illness their quality of life has also sunk to a level where they say it's not worth living, and they see no prospect that their life will ever again be worth living, and so they ask for a physician to assist them in dying. And that's something that I've supported for many years. I think that patients should be legally able to ask a physician to help. And that has actually been spreading over the last 30 years now. First became openly practiced, if not quite fully legal, in the Netherlands in the 1980s, then was fully legalized in the Netherlands at the beginning of this century. Was copied in Belgium and Luxembourg, and in slightly varying forms now exists in Canada, down the entire west coast of the United States, and also a number of other states, and was quite recently legislated for in the state where I originally come from in Australia, in the state of Victoria. So I support that for those cases, and I think in the case you described, if we're really clear that this prisoner has thought about this, it's not just a temporary whim. You know, you say, look, you know, you tell me this now, I'm going to let you think about it for another month and come back, see whether you still have the same view. If they really are you know, confident that that is their view and that is their strong wish, I would go along with that wish as well. That is, if that's what they want, I don't think we should be forcing them to stay alive.
For example, let's say there's a rat plague in the town, or another example would be wolves who are killing sheep. What would you think? Is it allowed to kill those animals, or in other words, how annoying have an animal to be allowed to kill it?
So with the wolves, I guess there's a question about are the wolves in danger? So wolves, for example, were reintroduced to the United States. They'd been exterminated from the lower 48 states. In other words, there's still wolves in Alaska, but everywhere else there were no wolves. They were deliberately reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park and a couple of other parks. And they have now spread beyond the parks, and they are killing sheep outside the parks. But because they're still in fairly small numbers, the government does not allow the ranchers to kill the wolves, but instead compensates the ranchers for the loss of the sheep to the wolves. But I suppose if the wolves continue to multiply, at some point they will allow the ranchers to kill the wolves. Now, this again goes back to that other question about what should we think about predators and prey. Should we kill the wolves to protect the sheep? In this case, we have our own interest in the sheep, whether it's through eating them or the wool that we're getting from them. Should we kill the predators? And I suppose there's a case for saying that that's acceptable, that it's one animal or another that you're having to choose between, and the wolf will in fact kill many sheep. So if the wolves are not themselves endangered, that might be an acceptable outcome there. In the case of the rat plague, I guess you didn't specify exactly what the rats are doing in this plague. Are they spreading a disease? Are they spreading bubonic plague so that we're all going to die unless we control the rats? Then I think we're justified in killing the rats. Are they eating up all of the food so that we're actually not going to have enough to eat? Again, I think we're justified in killing them. Are they, in some way a lesser sort of problem, that we don't like them, we don't like seeing rats and they're a nuisance? Well, maybe then we can simply find ways to keep them out of our houses rather than killing them all. But it's possible that we can't do that and that we simply can't live with them. I think it matters then whether we find humane ways of killing them or not. And some of the poisons that are typically used for rats are not particularly humane. So I think, again, if we really were concerned about animals' interest in not suffering, we would be finding more humane ways of killing them.
Hello. Earlier you quoted Bentham, who thought about a line between the beings which have the status of and the beings which do not. But I think you haven't specified what your own line would be, where to draw the line between which beings matter and which do not. Like you could say insects have interests to stay alive, or a tree has the interest to grow. So yeah, where to draw the line?
Yeah, good point. I didn't go into that. So for me, the line is the line of where a being is conscious. That is, where a being can feel something. So I've talked about pain and pleasure. They're conscious states. A being that is not conscious cannot feel them, and I think doesn't have interests in the true sense. So you mentioned trees. I don't think trees are conscious beings. I know there have been some books written that perhaps raise questions about that, but to me the best current state of science is that trees and plants in general are not conscious beings. But I think we ought to be a bit more agnostic about insects. And again, insects is a huge category of beings with varying kinds of nervous systems, various kinds of brains, and various degrees of complexity of behavior. So maybe you might say, look, there's some evidence that bees could be conscious, but there's very little evidence that a roundworm is conscious, a much similar sort of simpler kind of organism. I think that may be true of some mollusks as well. So I think there's no real evidence that oysters are conscious, and so what I've said about not eating animals doesn't really apply to oysters or other bivalves like mussels or clams. I doubt that they're conscious. But on the other hand, where there's more doubt, where you get up to crustacea, I think there's more doubt, more chance that they are conscious, so I don't eat them. But certainly the line becomes a bit grey at some point. I think it's not grey for vertebrates. I think it's pretty clear that all vertebrates, including fish, are capable of feeling pain. And some invertebrates, you look at the very complex behaviour in octopus, which is a mollusk, but it can solve problems and do amazing escapes from captivity and so on. Hard to believe that it can do that and not be conscious. So it's not it's not, you can't draw the line in any very simple place like vertebrates. But I think you have to look at what the evidence is. There's a clear area where I think they're above the line. There's an area where it's rather grey and they may or may not be above the line, and there's another area of living things that are pretty clearly below the line.
I was wondering how the final state of animal liberation would look like. So whether all humans would be vegans, or whether there would be no animal kept by a human anymore.
So would, in an ideally animal liberated world, would humans be vegan? I certainly think we wouldn't be rearing and killing animals for food the way we are now, and we wouldn't be catching fish the way we are now, and we wouldn't be producing dairy. As some of you will have heard, there's research going on to produce meat at the cellular level. So you take cells of an animal and you get them to reproduce in vitro, basically in a growth solution. And if that, it has succeeded in the sense of showing that you can produce something which is really meat at the cellular level. But it's not economically viable as yet. But if that were to become economically viable and people wanted to continue to eat meat, then I don't see an animal liberation objection to that, because there's never been a sentient animal. Or if there has, it was a long time ago and the cell was taken from that, and that animal is dead and can't suffer anymore. So it's possible that you could justify not being a vegan by having this cellular animal products. Not just meat, may apply to dairy products as well, or even to eggs, though I suppose they wouldn't be eggs laid in a shell like this, but they would be the same sorts of things. I do think that ideally we would not be raising animals commercially for food, because I think there's always pressure then to take commercial shortcuts and for the animals not to have good lives. Would that mean, some people ask, would that mean that there wouldn't be any cows or pigs or chickens? Well, we used to breed horses to pull wagons, big, heavy, strong horses, draft horses, Clydesdales, horses like that. We don't use them, or we use to pull wagons anymore, but they haven't become, those breeds haven't become extinct. There are some people who like them and who keep them, much smaller numbers than there used to be. So I imagine something like that might happen to cows and pigs and chickens as well. Would we have any companion animals? I think we might. I think we can have relationships that are reciprocal, where we treat animals really well, treat them as a member of the family, and they have good lives, and we're not exploiting them. So I would think that that's possible. Again, you might ask, well, if they were dogs and cats, what would we feed them on? And particularly the cats are rather difficult to rear without feeding them on meat. But if you assume also that we have this cultured meat, as it's sometimes called, or meat grown at the cellular level, then we could feed our cats on that, and then I guess we could still have cats. Okay.
I would like to know what
Can you hold the mic a bit closer, please?
I would like to know what you think about eating insects instead of meat.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm agnostic about whether insects can feel pain, and there's probably better evidence for some insects feeling pain than others. So I know that the Dutch government has experimented on growing mealworms, which is a kind of worm which has a very high conversion ratio in terms of converting grain to protein. So if the mealworm is a kind of simpler organism that's rather unlikely to feel pain, I would accept that. On the other hand, if you're talking about more complex insects, so I know that in some cultures people eat crickets. Crickets probably are more complex than mealworms, maybe can feel pain. And of course the disadvantage is that compared with eating a vertebrate, you're eating many of these animals in order to make a meal from them. So given that and given the that, perhaps we should avoid eating those insects where there seems to be a high or reasonable probability that they can feel pain.
So I thank you all very much. I thank Professor Singer, and yeah, have a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. Thank you.